The astropath named Lyris sat alone in her chamber on the frontier world of Tyran. Her blind eyes stared at nothing as her mind reached out into the void between stars. For 30 years she had listened to the whispers of the warp, carrying messages across impossible distances. She had felt joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, all flowing through the currents of psychic energy. But tonight she felt something new. Something that made her ancient heart freeze in her chest. That it started as a pressure against her thoughts. A weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. Then came the hunger. Not a simple desire for food, but a need so vast and so deep that it threatened to swallow her mind whole. Lyris opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In that terrible moment, she saw them. Millions upon millions of creatures, all connected to a single will. They moved through the darkness between galaxies, eating everything in their path. Stars meant nothing to them. Planets were simply food. And they were coming. Her final message reached Terra in broken pieces. The words made no sense to those who received them. They spoke of shadows that ate light, of a hunger that could never be filled, of a fleet so large that it blocked out the stars themselves. Most dismissed the message as the ravings of a dying mind. But one man did not. Inquisitor Kryptman had spent his life hunting the enemies of mankind. He had faced chaos cults and alien threats across 100 worlds. But the fragments from Tyran troubled him in ways he could not explain. He gathered every report from the Eastern Fringe, every story of worlds gone silent, every whisper of something terrible approaching. The pattern he found made his blood run cold. 23 worlds had stopped communicating in the past decade. At first, the Administratum blamed pirates or rebellion. But when scout ships finally reached these worlds, they found nothing. Not ruins. Not bodies. Nothing at all. The planets had been stripped down to bare rock. Oceans had vanished. Atmospheres had been sucked away. Even the soil was gone. Whatever had visited these worlds had consumed everything that could be consumed. Kryptman traveled to Tyran himself, though he knew he would find only death. The world that greeted him was a corpse. Brown and gray where green and blue should have been. His team found a single servoskull still functioning in the ruins of the capital city. The recordings it held would haunt Kryptman for the rest of his days. The images showed the sky darkening as thousands of living ships descended through the clouds. Creatures poured from these vessels like water from a broken dam. They came in forms that made no sense. Some crawled on dozens of legs. Others flew on wings of stretched skin. All of them killed and consumed with terrible speed. The defenders of Tyran fought bravely, but their weapons seemed useless. For every creature they killed, 10 more took its place. The recording ended with a wall of chitin and claws rushing toward the servoskull's position. Kryptman brought his findings to the High Lords of Terra. He stood before the most powerful humans in the galaxy and told them that something worse than chaos, worse than the orcs, worse than anything they had faced before was coming to devour them all. Some of the High Lords laughed at him. Others called him mad. A few simply refused to believe that any threat could be so severe, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. More worlds fell silent each month. The shadow in the warp grew darker. And then the first direct contact came. A battle fleet encountered the enemy near the Tyran system and sent a single message before being destroyed. The message contained only one word: Behemoth. The Ultramarines received word of the approaching threat in their fortress monastery on Makridge. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar studied the reports with growing concern. The Tyranids, as the creatures had been named, were heading directly for Ultramar. His realm of 500 worlds lay in the path of the Great Devourer. Calgar summoned his captains and told them what they faced. He did not hide the truth or offer false hope. The enemy outnumbered them beyond counting. The enemy felt no fear and knew no mercy. The enemy would not stop until everything was consumed. But the Ultramarines were the sons of Guilliman. They had defended humanity for 10,000 years. They would not fail now. The tactical displays showed the hive fleet spreading across space like a stain. Dozens of tendrils reached toward different systems, each one containing enough creatures to overwhelm entire armies. All of them converged on a single point. All of them headed for Makridge. Calgar stood before the hologram, his ancient armor gleaming in the blue light. His brothers gathered around him, waiting for his words. These were warriors who had faced every horror the galaxy could offer. Yet even they felt something close to fear as they watched the enemy approach. The chapter master spoke with a voice that carried no doubt. Makridge would hold. The walls would not fall. The Ultramarines would stand against the darkness as they had always stood. And if they failed, if even the sons of Guilliman could not stop this tide, then the Imperium itself would fall. The shadow grew closer. The hunger approached. And on the fortress world of Makridge, the defenders prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of humanity itself. The skies above Makridge turned black on the day the Tyranids arrived. Not the black of night, but something deeper and more terrible. The bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth blocked out the stars themselves as they descended toward the world below. There were so many of them that the orbital stations could not count them all. Each ship was a living thing, grown from flesh and bone, carrying millions of creatures in its belly. Captain Invictus stood on the walls of the fortress of Hera and watched the enemy come. He had served the chapter for 200 years. He had fought orcs and chaos marines and a dozen other threats. But nothing had prepared him for this sight. The Tyranid ships did not move like vessels built by hands. They swam through space like fish through water, their massive bodies pulsing with hideous life. The Imperial Navy engaged the Hive fleet in orbit. Battleships and cruisers fired everything they had at the approaching swarm. Macro cannons tore through bioships, spilling their contents into the void. Lance batteries burned holes through living hulls. For a moment, it seemed like the defenders might hold. Then the Tyranids adapted. The creatures learned from every attack. They changed their formations, grew thicker armor, developed new weapons. Ships that had been wounded moments before now shrugged off the same attacks. The Navy fought with desperate courage, but courage alone could not stop what was coming. One by one, the Imperial ships fell. Their crews died screaming as Tyranid organisms burrowed through their hulls. The ground war began when the first spores struck the surface of Makridge. Pods filled with warrior organisms crashed into cities and military bases across the planet. From each pod came a tide of claws and teeth. Termagants scuttled forward on 4 legs, firing living weapons that shot beetles and maggots. Hormagaunts leaped across the battlefield, their scything talons cutting through armor like paper. Behind them came the larger creatures. Warriors that stood twice the height of a man. Carnifexes that could tear through tank armor with their bare claws. The Ultramarines met the enemy with bolter and blade. Their shots exploded inside Tyranid bodies, blowing them apart from within. Their swords cut through chitin and flesh. But for every creature they killed, more kept coming. The Tyranids did not retreat. They did not hesitate. They simply pressed forward, climbing over the bodies of their fallen to reach the defenders. Chaplain Cassius rallied the defenders at the northern gate when the line threatened to break. His skull-faced helmet and burning eyes struck fear into the hearts of normal men, but the Tyranids knew no fear. They came for him in waves, and he met them with his blessed Crozius. Each swing crushed alien skulls. Each prayer to the Emperor gave strength to the warriors around him. Cassius had sworn to destroy every Tyranid in the galaxy, and on that day he began to fulfill his oath. The polar fortresses fell one by one. These ancient strongholds had stood for 10,000 years, but they could not stand against the endless tide. The garrisons fought to the last man, buying time for reinforcements that would never come. Commander Ventress led a counterattack that reclaimed one fortress for 6 hours before being forced to withdraw. Every victory cost more lives than the Imperium could afford to lose. Marneus Calgar himself took to the field when the enemy reached the gates of the fortress of Hera. The chapter master wore his ancient power fists, weapons that could crush adamantine steel. He waded into the Tyranid swarm like a god of war, each blow killing a dozen creatures. Around him, his honor guard fought with equal fury. They were the best warriors the chapter had to offer, and they sold their lives dearly. Then the Swarmlord came. This creature was no simple beast. It carried the intelligence of the entire hive mind within its four-armed body. It had fought and died 1,000 times across 1,000 worlds, and each death only made it stronger. The Swarmlord had killed Space Marine chapter masters before. It intended to add Calgar to its collection. The duel that followed would become legend. Calgar and the Swarmlord fought through the halls of the Fortress of Hera, their battle destroying priceless relics and ancient stonework. The chapter master was faster. The Swarmlord was stronger. They traded blows that would have killed lesser warriors instantly. Blood flowed from wounds that neither combatant seemed to notice. That in the end, Calgar fell. His body broken, his armor cracked, he lay at the feet of his enemy. But he had bought time. Enough time for the first company to reach the tunnels beneath the fortress. Enough time for them to plant the charges that would collapse the caverns and bury thousands of Tyranids under millions of tons of rock. Every Terminator in the first company died in that explosion. They died so that Macridge might live. The Hive fleet behemoth was destroyed in orbit when the last Imperial ships rammed their enemies in suicide attacks. Without the fleet, the Tyranids on the surface were cut off from reinforcement. The survivors were hunted down over the following months. Macridge had held, but the cost was beyond measure. Half the chapter lay dead. The first company existed only in memory. Calgar would spend years in a healing coma, his body slowly being rebuilt by the finest apothecaries in the Imperium. And in the darkness between stars, the librarian sensed something that made their victory feel hollow. This had been only the first wave. The Tyranids were not defeated. They were simply regrouping. And the next time they came, they would remember everything they had learned. 40 years passed after the Battle of Macridge. The Imperium rebuilt what it could and mourned what it had lost. Veterans of the First Tyrannic War told stories of the horrors they had faced, but many who heard these tales did not truly believe them. The threat seemed distant now, a nightmare from the past that would not return. They were wrong. The astropaths felt it first. Across 1,000 light-years, psychically gifted humans began to experience the same terrible vision. A great darkness spreading through the void. A hunger that made Behemoth seem like a single drop in an endless ocean. When the visions faded, many of the astropaths were dead. Those who survived could only speak one word: Kraken. Hive fleet Kraken did not attack like its predecessor. Behemoth had been a single massive force, a hammer blow aimed at the heart of Ultramar. Kraken was different. It split itself into hundreds of smaller tendrils, each one striking a different system at the same time. There was no front line to defend, no single point where the Imperium could concentrate its forces. The enemy was everywhere at once. Inquisitor Kryptman watched the reports flood in with growing horror. World after world fell to the swarm. Some were consumed in days. Others held for weeks before being overwhelmed. The pattern was impossible to predict. Just when the defenders thought they understood the enemy's strategy, the Tyranids would change their approach. They learned from every battle, adapted to every tactic, evolved to counter every weapon. Kryptman made a decision that would haunt him forever. If the Tyranids could not be stopped, perhaps they could be starved. He proposed the creation of a dead zone, a barrier of lifeless worlds that would deny the swarm the biomass it needed to survive. The High Lords agreed, though many protested the cost. Billions of Imperial citizens were evacuated from dozens of worlds. Those who could not be saved in time were left behind. Then the Exterminatus fleet arrived. Virus bombs and cyclonic torpedoes rained down on populated worlds. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to ash. Forests that had taken centuries to grow were burned in moments. Kryptman watched each world die and told himself it was necessary. The sacrifice of billions might save trillions. But the screams of the dying echoed in his dreams for the rest of his life. The cordon sanitaire slowed the Kraken, but it did not stop it. The Hive fleet simply adjusted its course, seeking new sources of food. One tendril found its way to the craft world Iandon, home to one of the largest Eldar populations in the galaxy. The ancient vessel drifted through space, its wraithbone corridors filled with the ghosts of a dying race. Now it faced extinction at the claws of the great devourer. The Eldar fought with desperate skill. Their weapons were more advanced than anything the Imperium possessed. Their warriors had trained for centuries in the art of war. But the Tyranids cared nothing for skill or technology. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, until the defenders were exhausted. Iondan's salvation came from an unexpected source. Prince Uriel had been exiled from the craft world years before, cast out for his pride and ambition. He had become a corsair, a pirate who preyed on ships of all races. But when he learned of his home's peril, old grudges meant nothing. He gathered his fleet and raced to Iondan's defense. Uriel carried with him the Spear of Twilight, a weapon of terrible power. The spear had been forged in ancient times by a dying god, and it carried a curse. Anyone who wielded it would eventually be consumed by its hunger. Uriel knew this when he took up the weapon. He did not care. His people needed him. The prince led his forces into the heart of the Tyranid swarm. His spear cut through hive ships like a blade through cloth. Where he passed, the enemy fell in their thousands. The Eldar rallied around their returning champion, fighting with renewed hope. Together, they pushed the Tyranids back from Iondan's docks and corridors. The battle lasted for weeks. The Craftworld's infinity circuit, the repository of all Eldar souls, was nearly destroyed. Entire clans were wiped out. The dead outnumbered the living by the time the last Tyranid fell. But Iondan survived. Wounded, broken, but alive, across the galaxy, other battles raged. Space Marine chapters rushed from one crisis to the next, trying to stem the tide. The Imperial Guard threw millions of soldiers into the meat grinder. Worlds that had never known war learned its horrors firsthand. The Second Tyrannic War became a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Eventually, Hive Fleet Kraken was broken. Not defeated, but scattered into dozens of splinter fleets that would plague the Imperium for centuries to come. The main body of the swarm had been destroyed through sacrifice and blood. But Kryptman found no comfort in victory. That he studied the patterns of the invasion, the way the Tyranids had adapted and evolved. Every weapon the Imperium had used was now known to the Hive mind. Every tactic had been analyzed and countered. The creatures were not just animals following instinct. They were learning. Growing. Preparing. Kryptman looked at the star charts showing the direction from which the Hive fleets came. Somewhere out there, in the darkness between galaxies, more were waiting. And when the next fleet arrived, it would know everything its predecessors had learned. The Imperium had won 2 wars against the Tyranids. But the true battle had not yet begun. The shadow in the warp had grown beyond anything the Imperium had experienced before. Astropaths across the galaxy screamed in unison as their minds touched the edge of something vast and terrible. Navigators reported that entire regions of space had become impassable, the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon blocked by a presence so massive it defied comprehension. The Third Tyrannic War had begun before anyone even knew to call it that. Hive Fleet Leviathan approached from below the galactic plane. This direction of attack was unprecedented. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had watched the stars for threats. No one had thought to look beneath them. The Tyranids had learned from Behemoth and Kraken. They had studied Imperial defenses and found the one gap that remained. By the time the first warnings reached Terra, dozens of worlds had already fallen. The scale of Leviathan dwarfed everything that had come before. If Behemoth had been a fist and Kraken had been a web, then Leviathan was an ocean. Its tendrils stretched across thousands of light years, each one capable of consuming entire systems. The Hive fleet did not just seek to devour the Imperium. It sought to cut it in half, separating reinforcement routes and isolating entire sectors. Inquisitor Kryptman faced an impossible choice. The Cordon Sanitaire had worked against Kraken, but there was no way to burn enough worlds to stop Leviathan. The Hive fleet was simply too large, too spread out, too adaptable. A different strategy was needed. A terrible strategy that would make his previous crimes seem merciful by comparison. Kryptman ordered the capture of live Tyranid specimens. His agents bred these creatures in secret facilities, growing new organisms that carried a genetic marker the hive mind would recognize. Then he released them on worlds in the path of the largest orc empire in the galaxy. The message was clear: food awaited in that direction. Leviathan responded as Kryptman had hoped. A significant portion of the hive fleet diverted toward the orc worlds, drawn by the promise of abundant biomass. The orcs, being orcs, welcomed the challenge with barbaric enthusiasm. The Octarius War began, a conflict between two species that knew only war and hunger. Each battle made both sides stronger. Each victory provided more resources for the next fight. Kryptman had not solved the problem. He had merely delayed it while creating a new nightmare for future generations. The remaining tendrils of Leviathan continued toward the heart of the Imperium. They swept through the Cryptus system, consuming world after world in their path. The Blood Angels chapter, already stretched thin across a dozen war zones, received word that the enemy approached their domain. Chapter Master Dante gathered every warrior he could spare and prepared for the defense of Baal. Dante was the oldest living space marine in the Imperium, a warrior who had fought for over 1,000 years. He had faced every enemy humanity had ever known and defeated them all. But even he felt something close to despair when he saw the size of the approaching fleet. The Tyranids outnumbered his forces by millions to one. Victory through conventional means was impossible. The Shield of Baal campaign became the largest gathering of space marines since the dark days of the heresy. The Blood Angels called upon their successor chapters, and those chapters answered. The Flesh Tearers came despite their reputation for savagery. The Angels and Carmen arrived with their precious relics. The Angels Sanguine emerged from their mysterious fortress. Brothers who had not stood together for centuries united against the common threat. Sister Superior Helena led her Order of the Sacred Rose to the defense of the Shrine World Asphodex. Her battle sisters faced the Tyranid swarm with faith as their shield and fire as their sword. They knew they could not win. They fought anyway. When the ammunition ran out, they used their blessed blades. When the blades broke, they used their hands. When they could no longer stand, they prayed. The sisters died to the last woman, but they denied the enemy 50,000 tons of biomass that would have fed the swarm. The battles across the Cryptus system bought time for Baal's defenses to prepare. Dante organized his forces with the precision of a master tactician. Every approach was covered. Every fortress was manned. Every weapon was loaded and ready. The Blood Angels and their successors stood shoulder to shoulder, united by blood and purpose. The fighting lasted for months. Wave after wave of Tyranids crashed against the defenses of Baal and its moons. The sands ran red with blood, both human and alien. Space Marines who had never known defeat learned the bitter taste of retreat. Entire companies were wiped out in hours. The dead piled so high that they formed new hills on the barren landscape. Then the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half. The psychic cataclysm that would later be called the Cicatrix Maledictum ripped through reality, separating the Imperium into two halves. Baal found itself on the dark side of the rift, cut off from Terra and all hope of reinforcement. The Tyranids, unaffected by the warp storm, pressed their attack with renewed fury. Dante stood on the walls of the Arx Angelicum and watched his chapter die. 10,000 years of history were being erased before his eyes. The sons of Sanguinius, the noble defenders of humanity, were being consumed by an enemy that would not even remember their names. The chapter master had always known he would die in battle. He had just hoped it would mean something, but in the darkest moment, when all seemed lost, a light appeared in the sky. Ships bearing the symbol of the Indomitus Crusade broke through the Great Rift. Robot Guilliman, the Primarch reborn, had come to save his brother's sons. The Tyranids had won many battles on Baal. They would not win the war. Robot Guilliman walked through the ruins of a world that had once been beautiful. Green fields had become grey ash. Blue oceans had been drained to the last drop. The cities were gone, not even rubble remaining to mark where millions had lived and died. The Tyranids had been thorough. They always were. The Primarch of the Ultramarines had awakened to find his father's Imperium burning on all fronts. Chaos poured through the Great Rift. Orcs rampaged across entire sectors. Ancient enemies stirred in their tombs. But of all the threats facing humanity, the Tyranids concerned Guilliman most deeply. These creatures were not motivated by hatred or conquest or any emotion he could understand. They simply consumed. And they would not stop until nothing remained. Guilliman summoned every survivor of the tyrannic wars to his flagship. Veterans of Makridge stood beside defenders of Iyanden. Blood angels who had held the line at Baal shared tables with Imperial Guard soldiers who had fought on 100 forgotten worlds. Inquisitor Cryptman, old now and weighted with guilt, presented his findings on Tyranid evolution and behavior. The Primarch listened to them all. The stories painted a picture of an enemy unlike any the Imperium had faced. The Tyranids did not build civilizations or seek power. They did not negotiate or retreat. They were a force of nature given form, a hunger that existed only to spread. Every hive fleet defeated was replaced by another. Every adaptation overcome was followed by a new evolution. The galaxy itself was their prey. Chaplain Cassius, his face scarred by decades of war against the Great Devourer, spoke of what he had witnessed. Entire systems consumed in weeks. Defenders torn apart by creatures bred specifically to counter their weapons. The hive mind watching through a billion eyes, learning, adapting, waiting. The old warrior's voice was steady, but his eyes held a darkness that never faded. Chapter Master Dante described the defense of Baal with quiet dignity. He spoke of brothers who had died fighting to the last breath. Of successor chapters that had been reduced to handfuls of survivors. Of the moment when he had truly believed that 1,000 years of service would end in the belly of a Tyranid bioship. Guilliman placed his hand on the ancient warrior's shoulder and spoke words of thanks that brought tears to eyes that had not wept in centuries. The Primarch studied the tactical data with the mind that had written the Codex Astartes. He saw patterns that others had missed. The hive fleets were not random. They were probing attacks, testing Imperial defenses and gathering information. Each invasion pushed deeper into the galaxy while measuring the response. The Tyranids were not just feeding. They were preparing. Guilliman called a council of war in the strategium of the Makridge's honor. Around the tables sat chapter masters, lord generals, admirals, and inquisitors. The fate of countless worlds rested on the decisions made in that room. The Primarch did not waste time on ceremony that he outlined a new doctrine for fighting the Tyranids. No more reactive defenses. No more waiting for the enemy to strike. The Imperium would identify approaching hive fleets and intercept them in the void, where their numbers meant less. New weapons would be developed specifically to counter Tyranid biology. The Primaris Marines, his greatest creation, would be deployed wherever the threat was greatest, but Guilliman was honest about the limitations of his plan. The Tyranids could not be defeated through conventional victory. There would be no treaty to sign, no enemy leader to kill, no capital to conquer. The war would continue as long as the hive mind existed. And the hive mind was not limited to the creatures in the galaxy. It stretched back through the void to something far larger than any fleet yet encountered. That he shared what the librarians had discovered through their studies of the hive mind. The fleets that had invaded the Imperium were not the main force. They were not even a significant fraction of it. Somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, the true Tyranid swarm drifted through the eternal night. It had consumed other galaxies before reaching this one. It would consume more after. Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan were merely the first taste of what was coming. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Warriors who had faced death 1,000 times struggled to comprehend the scale of the threat. Generals who had commanded millions felt suddenly small. Even Guilliman, the son of a god, seemed diminished by the shadow that loomed beyond the stars. Then Marneus Calgar stood. The chapter master of the Ultramarines had been rebuilt after his battle with the Swarm Lord. His body was more machine than flesh now, but his spirit remained unbroken. He spoke of his homeworld standing against impossible odds. He spoke of brothers who had given everything so that others might live. He spoke of a species that refused to accept extinction. The Tyranids were vast beyond measure. Their hunger was eternal and their patience infinite. But humanity had something the hive mind could not understand. Humans fought not just to survive, but for meaning. For honor. For the memory of those who came before and the hope of those who would come after. The great devourer consumed worlds, but it could not consume that. Gilliman looked at the warriors gathered around him. They were tired. They were wounded. Many of them would not survive the wars to come. But in their eyes he saw something that gave him hope. Defiance. A refusal to surrender that transcended logic or reason. The same spirit that had carried humanity through 10,000 years of darkness, the Primarch addressed the galaxy through a transmission that reached every world still loyal to Terra. He did not promise victory. He did not minimize the threat. He told humanity the truth about what they faced and asked them to stand anyway. To fight not because they would win, but because fighting was the only choice worthy of their ancestors and their descendants. In the void between galaxies, the true hive fleet continued its ancient journey. It had all the time in the universe. It had consumed civilizations older than humanity and would consume civilizations not yet born. But ahead of it burned the light of the Astronomicon, and around that light, a stubborn species prepared to make the great devourer pay for every world it took. The Tyranid invasions were far from over. The deadliest wars in galactic history still lay ahead. But humanity had survived the first waves and learned their lessons in blood. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They would face it standing. And they would make the stars themselves remember their defiance.